Kyle McNulty, and you're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. With me in this episode is Mike Roth. Mike is the CEO and founder of Evo Security, which is building an identity and access management solution specifically designed for managed service providers. He started the company back in 2018 after leaving behind a private equity fund focused on oil and gas. In the episode, we discuss his transition into cyber from the energy world and what makes Evo uniquely positioned to serve the needs of MSPs given the variety of IAM solutions available on the market today. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks for having me. It's been a little while.
Yeah, take me back to the earlier days of your career, because you certainly have a very non-traditional background, let's say, into becoming a cybersecurity founder. You were, if I'm remembering correctly, an engineering manager at an energy company, and you ended up starting your own private equity fund that was also focused on energy markets. And I think from what you were saying earlier, it was kind of focused on oil and gas specifically. Tell me a little bit more about what that early career looked like and then how you ultimately transitioned that into cyber.
Yeah, I often joke, it's like from the outside looking in, it's super nonlinear, but in my mind, it makes perfect sense. So yeah, I'll unpack it for you. I got a degree in petroleum engineering. And basically what that means, it's like a combination of like mechanical, chemical engineering, and then and probably about 50% geophysics and geology. So it's like this interesting combination of like, how to go do mechanical things in geospatial ways, right? And that led me to these interesting projects where, I'd be out in the field, I'd see these SCADA systems, I see the way that data was collected from these really, high value assets, like hundreds of millions or billions of dollars worth of assets, right? And then the data ultimately was transmitted back to our office and to a private network, which had really poor like identity and privilege access management around that. Now, this is back in like the mid 2000s, right? So, a lot of the companies today, like, CyberArk, Ping, Okta, Duo, you name it, they were babies, they were brand new. And so these problems were becoming real. And I just kept noticing that. And then also SaaS was starting to emerge. And our company, we were publicly traded, which was really alarming to me because I saw as an engineer, okay, I've got, and actually I had a Lean Six Sigma project with the SCADA systems. And so I saw the way that the data came into the our private network and into a database, who had access to it, how it was massaged, and then ultimately got rolled up and reported to the SEC. And there was no way that was 100% accurate, right? Like we did have an independent third-party auditor like come in and they look at stuff, but they're using data that had already been generally, massaged. And so, and it wasn't anything egregious or nefarious, like nobody was doing anything intentional. It was just the way things were at the time. And so in parallel, like I'm also seeing that, okay, I've got MFA on my workstation. I don't have MFA on this machine out in the field. I have this identity to log into this particular application and these identities to log into these things over here. and it just seemed really messy. So I remember I was living in Dallas, Texas at the time, and there was a new startup incubator that had just emerged called Tech Wildcatters, which, was a play off of the word, going out doing oil and gas stuff. So kind of cool space that emerged. It was actually in this old church, really unique situation. But I pitched the concept of a password manager, and I kept thinking about it. I was like, I just need like a wallet of credentials that's easily accessible. iPhones were, starting to make their emergence, and, things were starting to feel a little easier and accessible. And so I pitched that concept, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I was like, okay, who wants one password to like govern all your passwords? That seems really silly. Like that just doesn't make any sense. Missed that one. But anyway, I developed this sort of passion for what I came to learn was identity and access management. What was interesting, and this kind of ties into, what Evo does ultimately, but I definitely became the most annoying engineer to our internal IT department, because I was like, guys, like I still have access to this thing. I know that person has access, like they shouldn't. And that could have been anything from folders to, whatever it was at the time that we were working on. And, but I also kind of gained this sort of respect for how difficult their job was with the tools that they had and how messy things can get from an IT administration standpoint. And the fact that there's a lot of liability riding on their success rate, right? So that's sort of how I got into security. It was just through experience and observation in a different industry, seeing gaps. And then, I guess from there, I decided, okay, there's kind of two ways out. I could either go get a new degree in something and then go into cybersecurity, or I could go start a fund or something and then use the capital that I would potentially make from that to then go and seed a new venture. And so I chose that route because I wanted to kind of like, complete the circle in energy. So I did. We raised, it was almost 50 million total, but we across 5 different limited partnerships. So we had some good exits, and I did exactly that. So like we kind of reached a sort of end of the road. It's like, okay, we've sold all the assets, we've invested in them, we've then sold them. So like, do I want to keep going in this, or do I want to now make that transition? And I did. I decided to make the transition out, and this was, about 2016 timeframe. So I had been in energy for a decade. I just started to look at the attack surface, like where was it going? What was the state of things? Which companies were trying to solve the problem at the enterprise level? And ultimately, I just concluded that everything's going to the mid-market and the SMB. And the way to access that isn't one by one. You have to do it in this sort of force multiplier methodology. And so I started to investigate the channel. And I think the way that most people understand the channel is like you are taking enterprise products and you're instrumenting them and selling them or reselling them back into enterprises, right? But there's this whole other part of the channel that the MSP really owns, which is the mid-market and the SMB. And it's like almost this entirely different universe of the way things work. And that to me was kind of my aha moment. So it's like, hey, helping out the IT guys that I gained so much respect for, getting in front of the kind of vector of the attack surface. And then I sort of looked around at like, well, who's doing IAM with this sort of enterprise grade mentality in that space? And I really didn't find very many companies. And it's super non-sexy stuff. This is nuts and bolts fundamentals. This is not generative AI. This is like nuts and bolts. Rewind 5 to 7 years from where the enterprise is today. That's where the MSP is today, with respect to IAM. So huge opportunity with a market that's as big or bigger than the enterprise. So that's the story, and that's how I kind of landed on this strategy of Evo Security.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great summary, kind of walking through the different stages of that journey. And we'll certainly come back to the whole MSP conversation in just a minute here. But there's something interesting that I haven't actually heard before that you mentioned in that story, which is you started the fund specifically to gain capital to then start the company, right? And kind of set yourself up for that. And so many founders, ultimately at the end of the day, whether they are super forthcoming about it or not, are building that company for the financial exit as opposed to like building up a financial stockpile to then go and start the company, right? So kind of an opposite order there. So the kind of first thing that comes to mind is, oh, you wanted to do that because maybe you wanted to bootstrap the company, right? And so you needed that kind of extra capital on the sideline in order to be able to finance it start to finish from that more kind of bootstrapped model. But you're also kind of in the venture capital life cycle at this point. So what was your logic and rationale to say, oh, I should go and build this kind of capital store for myself before I go ahead and start a company, as opposed to just jumping right in at the time and committing to that venture cycle like you ultimately ended up doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no real like single big reason. I would say it was sort of a blend of things. I didn't know if I was even going to have the returns or experience the returns that I was hoping to experience. Number one, so it could have been zero. And then I would have had to figure out a new path. It could have been something that would have been like grand slam, knock it out of the park. And then, maybe I decide to do something totally different, or I just take my time in figuring out what is that next thing going to be, or something in the middle, which is what it ended up being, which was like, hey, definitely worth my while. Got a couple of licks that were meaningful, but not enough to where I'm like going and retiring on the beach or something like that, right? Like, so I had a limited sort of window for myself to say like, okay, I'm going to narrow down my list of things that are of interest to me. I am being at the top of the list, and then saying, okay, I'm going to give myself X amount of time to go do research to prove and demonstrate with my analyst hat on why I should invest this personal capital into the business, seeding it myself. So that was part of the logic. The other part was I knew that I was going to be starting from scratch in an entirely new industry. I had no network. I didn't really know anything about security other than what I told you. And so I needed to go educate myself. And I knew that was going to take time as well. And so I thought that before someone would entrust me to enough to invest in Evo Security, in me and in the idea, I needed to go prove and take the risk myself and demonstrate that there's a market here and collect the data. And again, with my analyst hat on, in addition to my like innovators hat on, and then present that to venture capital and say, here, look, like, I know that I'm not a 20-year software veteran, or I didn't like work at, CrowdStrike before this or whatever. Like, I'm new to the game, but I believe what I see here to be very real. And this is a real opportunity and it's investable. So I try to be very rational about it. But at the same time, like with enough like measured and calculated risk to be able to like frame it up and prove it out. So that was really the logic.
Yeah, it's a great level of foresight, I would say, because certainly as a general rule, I would say it's fair that cybersecurity investors index more heavily on industry experience just because how close-knit of a community it is and how technical and in the weeds certain segments of it are. So to your point, like there probably would have been a lot of skepticism otherwise if you were looking for that like pre-seed round on just an idea without the kind of hands-on experience on the other side of things. So obviously that strategy paid off for you in terms of getting to where you are today. So let's bring it back then to the problem at hand with Evo. And you talked a little bit about kind of the market need for it, or at least the market positioning, where there's just all these kind of classic IAM problems that exist across organizations of all sizes. You have companies that have spun up to address the enterprise need, but basically the MSP and like small medium business markets are still kind of left largely let's say, unattended. So with that, we're thinking about like multi-factor authentication. We're thinking about credential management, credential provisioning, and like access management in terms of restricting the access to different applications and like specific permissions within those applications, right? Thinking about that from, again, this kind of MSP context, what is it about some of those enterprise tools? Let's just take like CyberArk as one example of like traditional classic enterprise IAM. What is it about those skill sets or those capability sets that just wasn't really applicable to MSPs? Why couldn't MSPs use that? And maybe the answer is price, but let's hear it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a couple of obvious things. One of them is price, but the other one is the way that those products are built fundamentally. So if you think about an enterprise product, and while some of them do have multi-tenant portals, they're sort of half-baked and clunky and not like totally geared toward, it's really like a layer that's been slapped on top of their other product. But really, a lot of those products are built for this one-to-one administration. You have one product that is built to serve one company at a time. And so with that comes a lot of technical decision-making on how you've built that product, how you've built that process, how you've built the agent, how you've built the onboarding, how it's distributed. Like everything you think about is in this one-to-one sort of capacity. But when you start to cross the threshold over onto the MSP and you say, I'm abandoning that mentality, and everything that we build is for one to many, and everything that, whether it's how we instrument the agent, how that agent is deployed across machines, how you engage with the admin portal, how things are priced, how we structure the way that we, architect things in the cloud to keep our COGS down. How do we have the proper segregation from a security standpoint and segmentation? So all of these things start to emerge architecturally, and it may not be obvious because at the end of the day, if you do MFA into something, you do MFA into something. If you are restricted from a privilege standpoint by, you can't install this update on this particular application on your machine, you need administrative approval to do so. Those experiences are all going to look and feel kind of similar, but the way that you've architected the entire product in order to serve not only the MSP themselves, where they're buying and consuming your product, but also for them to then turn around in the same portal, distribute and administer en masse across hundreds of other companies. And that, in our experience, is a sharp right turn and deviation on how you build something. And so it just became really interesting at the deeper we've gotten into this venture of how you have to start thinking about stuff.
What are some tactical, tangible examples of changes that the team made compared to those kind of existing capabilities? So you mentioned like agent deployment might look a little bit different for that one-to-many relationship. What did you specifically change for like agent deployment or some of these other examples like pricing in order to better address that?
Yeah, I think part of it is when you look at how much is built in a tool like CyberArk or in a tool like Okta or Ping or using those as examples, the MSP and the MSP customer doesn't need all of the complexity that's there. They need kind of a smaller subset because they just don't have the complex systems yet. And so what we've done is we've identified from those tools, we've said, okay, these are the areas that are important for the MSP and for their customers. We have to have this type of security that is able to be deployed and distributed, right? And so the first step was, okay, well, what's important and what isn't? And for example, like we don't need screen recording on a privileged access or like an administrative session yet. That is something we could do later, but the enterprise is going to say, I have to have that, so, okay, if we don't need that yet, then what are the things we need? So we reduce things down to like, what are the must-haves for phase one and the wants for phase two, and then the really nice to haves for phase three. So that allowed us to keep our COGS really low. And we designed the system in such a way where instead of like we don't need to charge $5, $6, $7, $8 per user per month because our COGS are $1 to $2 per user per month. Like, we can actually be economically quite competitive, and therefore the MSP can not only be incentivized to buy and use for themselves, but they can also resell it to their customers and have 50, 100, or even greater than 100% margins on IAM for the first time ever, right? So it's the first thing was figuring out what's important and then aligning our architecture and the way we build the product for keeping our COGS really low. So that was the first one. The other one is that, and this is sort of not as well known until you get into the MSP space, but the way that an enterprise product works is like, you have to instrument that thing into the enterprise like infrastructure, right? Like, there's a lot of, that's why companies like Optiv exist, because they're adding value by helping companies like implement products, right? But a lot of that almost goes entirely away once you get into the MSP level, that mid-market and the SMB, because those companies just aren't that complex. So they don't need someone to come instrument stuff. The MSP can actually do that for them in a really simple and high velocity way. So how do you then get into the stream, right? Like, how do you get into the MSP like pipeline of activity? Well, they have specific products that they use. So like, if you wake up tomorrow and you say, hey, I'm going to be an MSP, you're going to choose like ConnectWise, Enable, Kaseya, NinjaOne, one of these types of RMM or PSA vendors that have their ticketing systems. This I call it like the MSP operating system software. Like, you're going to pick one, right? Well, if you're not integrating into those solutions, then like you're on the outside looking in, right? So you have to align with the way that the MSP works. And that could be anything from those types of integrating with those types of tools all the way down to inside the partner portal. And you say, okay, I want to go deploy an agent. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I need to script it out, and it needs to go into one of those tools, and then it needs to get deployed. Well, how do those tools work? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, so then we need to actually, in our portal, put the right UX and UI workflow such that, we're inside the MSP technician's brain and we know what they want to do to then take that string and then go use it inside of one of their MSP tools. So like, you get to that level of granularity, where you're operationalizing and productizing the ways that they need to work in order to become a successful MSP. So hopefully that kind of did the trick for you there.
Yeah. So kind of two big pieces that you just described, right? The first is understanding the specific workflows and like integration points of MSPs. And then the second, or in reverse order, but is architecting the solution to just kind of have the key capabilities that the MSP actually requires based on their level of maturity. And so drilling into that second piece, because the goal of that, again, is kind of keeping your COGS low, which allows you to serve at a lower price. And then that's ultimately advantageous to the MSP, because if they can pay less for all the right capabilities, then great, that increases their bottom line. Thinking about the kind of longer term time horizon of what that looks like, right? You kind of have this precedent for what the evolution of IAM looks like in any organization, where like at some point they're going to presumably want screen recording the same way that enterprises use screen recording. So you almost like know your roadmap in a sense as these organizations get more complex, and as they take on additional customers, and as their customers start demanding more capabilities as well. So how do you think about the longer term architecture for your platform if you kind of understand that feature requests are going to continue coming in over time, and then all of a sudden, are you losing that kind of cost architecture advantage because now you need to provide all the same features that these traditional enterprise tools have been providing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say, truthfully, in part, in some areas, we don't know yet. We're still figuring out what the market wants or needs. I would say the market is maturing, and a lot of that is driven by compliance and regulation and insurance. So it's forcing MSPs and their customers to start to say like, okay, well, we have to have this stuff now. So, it's starting to be deployed in more volume, and with more volume come like increases the statistical like ask, right? Where someone says, "Hey, I saw that this other product can do this thing. Like, can you guys do that?" And so, I think we're kind of taking those one by one right now. I don't think we have any serious like hair on fire concerns around like, okay, if we implement this one thing over here, it's going to totally blow our cogs up, because we started out so low that like we've left ourselves a lot of room. And I think that's kind of the benefit to how we're building this consolidated IAM platform, is that we drew a hard line in the sand early on. And as a result, we cut out a lot of the fat. I've had conversations with other people, and they've said like, yeah, we just simply can't go that direction because like our sales team doesn't know how to sell to MSPs, by the way, is like a whole art and science in and of itself. And if you don't have the right go-to-market team who's been in the MSP space for years and years to understand the nuances on how to sell to them, how to build the right programs, and how to incentivize them to expand. I've also found that is a huge key to success. And believe it or not, there are not that many people in the world who really know how to do that well. And thankfully, we've got several who do. And they could transform your whole company. Or, we've seen other companies kind of enter the space. And even though you might have like decent technology, it might be a little bit more expensive, but, it's still attractive. Like you may just never get traction. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, going back to your question, I think we'll continue to evaluate that as we grow, but good thing is we left ourselves a lot of headroom to address those situations as they arise.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the kind of market opportunity that you're serving here, right? Because the logic or the kind of backstory that you presented was, hey, we see this opportunity in small, medium businesses, and we're going to address that market by going after the kind of MSPs that are serving them, right? So kind of taking that extra leap in there. Now, I think Huntress is a great example that I always point to in terms of a company that has built a very formidable business serving these traditionally underserved SMBs with cybersecurity services. And they kind of have their own managed security services model, right?
Yeah.
You, again, are going one step further and saying, we're going to specifically target the service providers that are targeting these small to medium businesses. So what's the kind of math you've done in terms of what that opportunity actually looks like going after those MSPs? And like, what is the kind of insight in terms of why some of these enterprise companies haven't made like a separate product offering to also serve that same market?
Yeah. Yeah, and we get that question a lot, especially when we're talking with investors and stuff who are, haven't spent as much time in the space. But the first of all, yeah, Huntress has done a fantastic job. They've been queened by the MSP space, and I think it's because they drew a hard line in the sand, and they said we were only serving MSPs and their customers. And they made, they had great timing where they offer a high amount of value, both to the MSP who doesn't have access to the level of sophistication that the enterprise has access to, right? So they've sort of like been able to grab this super juicy, like high value that an enterprise would expect as a baseline from a new product. And they've been able to capture that and deliver that, at a reasonable price point for the MSP themselves. So they're actually protecting the MSPs, and then their MSPs are reselling those services into their customer base. So we're effectively running the same playbook, but we're doing it with a different product category, and we have less services and more product. So, So I think that's what I noticed is that the best MSP focused vendors historically, whether it's the PSA and RMM guys, like, I mentioned earlier, like Datto and Kaseya, or somebody like a Huntress, if you have a sell to and a sell through strategy, you can build an enormous business. And kind of proof point here is that you would think that there shouldn't be a ConnectWise plus a Kaseya plus an Enable plus a Ninja One plus like a whole slew of smaller players all serving just one market. There should be some consolidation. And we have seen some consolidation, but not like 12 or 15 going into 3, right? It's still stayed pretty wide. And a lot of those companies do the same thing, right? So that tells you have a really large market that is global. And when you start to look at the math and I saw a recent study. It's like the top triangle is the enterprise. And then it did a count of the number of seats that exist in the mid-market and SMB space, both being like applicable for the MSP that could oversee or manage those customers. And then the seat count is actually 2x that of the enterprise. So we're looking at a market that's double the size globally. And then you say, okay, well, I'm going to cut the bottom out because I believe that some companies are so small that they don't even need an MSP. They're just like, there are enough product-led growth tools that they could just do what they need to do, and that's it. And that's super fair, and I would agree. So then what you're left with is still a healthy market size that's the same size as the enterprise. So that's kind of the math I saw, and I was like, man, nobody's looking at it. But what I will say is that it is a grind. Like, It is not, you have to do a higher number of deals. And MSPs have a wide range of variability on how they run their company. And while there's a lot of standardization that's unfolded as a result of the PSA and RMM vendors, as I pointed out, you still run into variability. And so it's just really challenging. You have to know how to sell to them and how to manage your roadmap appropriately. So, fascinating space, lots of upside.
There's an important clarifying aspect here, I think, because you're talking about this market for MSPs based on the kind of underlying seats that those MSPs are managing, right? And so I think this in some ways comes back to a pricing decision, because you talked about earlier how traditional enterprise pricing isn't really flexible enough for the kind of MSP strategy and their business model, right? So can you just maybe explain a little bit further specifically how your pricing works? Because if you're selling per seat at the MSP itself, then you're kind of just addressing that specific MSP market. If you're selling through, like you said, right, where that MSP now has to pay based on like the number of customers that they have and the number of seats that are managed through those customers, then all of a sudden you're kind of addressing that broader market in terms of every company that's being served by MSPs, which then gets you to that much larger number that I think you're alluding to. So what is that kind of pricing model that you guys have decided on?
Yeah, so we have 3 products, and they each have they're all per user. And so what we discovered was that when you're selling to the MSP, they're always managing endpoints and users, which are coming and going, and users are coming and going. And there's just constant shifting and movement around that, right? And so when we looked at like, okay, well, what makes sense? Well, the MSP is generally going to know how many technicians they have. If they don't, then there's like a bigger problem going on, right? Because you have a rogue person that you didn't know about. But so it's safe to say that like it's going to be easier for the MSP to understand that, hey, I have 100 technicians or 24 or 10 or 4, right? And therefore, some of our products we charge per technician, and we say it's unlimited endpoints. And that's usually more of the sell to model. We just make it really easy to digest. We say, forget about, counting all the rest of the stuff. And look, there are ways they could do it, but it's easy to do the math in the head. This comes back down to like the nuance I told you about our go-to-market team. It's like, okay, that's easy math. I can do that quickly. And I know what my spend is going to be in order to accomplish these requirements that I have from my insurance provider, whatever. So, that's one way to do it. And what we also found though is that, and this is kind of a whole nother branch of the conversation, is that MSPs they could fully manage the IT for their customers, or they could just co-manage the IT. So this introduces a whole nother of complexity in the product, right? Is like you have to introduce all these granular role-based access controls, which you don't really find in a lot of enterprise tools, because you can just have like single roles, or maybe you can create a custom one. But so now we might have an MSP that has, let's say they have 100 customers, 80 of them are co-managed and 20 are fully managed, meaning that out of those 80 co-managed, that means there's other IT staff that exist at their customer level. And those IT staff need to log into Evo to do certain stuff, but should only be able to see their own tenant, right? So here, another layer of multi-tenancy complexity. So we found though, in those co-managed situations, that you could also resell on a per technician basis, right? So we've also simplified it to the MSP, and then we've simplified it to the customer. And then like with our MFA SSO solution, that's just per user per month. Just like you would expect if you bought Duo or Okta or something like that. So nothing super fancy there, but there are ways to get clever also. And the other thing too is at MSPs, they often ask for like, okay, well, what can I get for free from you to trial it or test it out? Because we want to dog food it before we start reselling it. And so there's always ways that you embed that in your pricing and stuff that, it seems to work out well. So, but that's always a negotiation.
Yeah. I mean, even just that description goes back to what you said a few minutes ago, right? Where it's a grind selling to these MSPs, just all the different kind of moving pieces in terms of the different products, which all have a slightly different pricing structure, which all are used kind of differently in terms of by the MSP themselves versus by the end customer, or some hybrid of the two. But yeah, really appreciate the time, Mike, just kind of diving into this whole MSP world. Ceremonial last question for you. Are you guys currently hiring or looking for investment?
Yeah, both. Yeah, we are both. And so, we're more to come on that, but we will be expanding our team over the next couple of years. A lot of growth ahead of us. We've had a great last year, and this year's kicked off in a really favorable way. So we're excited to continue to grow the company, grow the team, and make an impact and do good in the world. So that's what it's ultimately about.
Perfect. Well, awesome. Again, really appreciate the time. It's great getting a better lens into this kind of side of the security space, which is often not the focus of attention. So glad that there's some solutions being put in place here.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me, and appreciate the time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.